Welcome to this second video for Unit 4, Settlement and Conflict on the Plains in 1861 to 1877. In this video, we're going to be focusing on homesteaders and what it was like to live and farm on the plains. As a bit of a recap, here is where we are in our America scheme. So we are looking at our fourth unit and our second bullet point. If you've missed the video for the first bullet point, the causes and nature of white American exploitation on the plains, pause this one and go back and watch that one first and then rejoin us a little later. So we are thinking about these three questions in Unit 4. How did railroads and ranches change the plains, which we focused on in video 1? How do homesteaders survive and thrive on the plains? And why was there so much bloodshed on the plains between 1861 and 1877? Today's video is going to focus on this second question. How did homesteaders survive and thrive on the plains? Now, as we learnt in the first video, the cattlemen built profitable ranches and used the plains for grazing, but what they didn't do was fence the land and try to grow crops on it. And instead, it was the first farmers, known as homesteaders, who first tried to turn the plains into farmland. Now, the homesteaders had begun settling on the plains before 1861, but there was very few of them then. In the 1860s and 1870s, hundreds of thousands of homesteaders headed west, and these people included free slaves from the southern states, immigrants from Europe, and Americans from the east. There were many push and pull factors which led people to move to the plains. Remember, a push factor is something that makes a person want to leave a place, and a pull factor is something which makes someone want to go to a particular place. So let's have a think about some of the push factors that made people want to head to the plains. Now, there'd been a banking crisis in the 1870s, which meant that many people were out of work. Land in eastern states was also very expensive. In addition to this, land in Oregon and California was rapidly increasing in price. And if you remember from our studies in Unit 3, Oregon and California were the places where people went to during the gold rush. Some of the pull factors that made people want to head to the plains, one of the big ones was the Homestead Act, which offered people 160 acres of land for free if they farmed it for 5 years. What was different about this law as well was that women could also apply for this as long as they were single. So there were actually upwards of about 15% of homesteaders were single women. Railroad companies also advertised the plains as a great place to farm. Railroads also allowed people to sell their farmed goods to cities more easily. So let's have a think about what it was like to actually live on the plains. Now, the plains were a long way from big towns, so getting supplies was extremely difficult. There weren't many trees, so building homes was also a challenge. Many houses were very small, and the lack of wood to burn meant they were cold in the winter. A lack of clean water meant that diseases such as cholera and typhoid killed many people. Children were particularly at risk from this. People could also feel very lonely and isolated whilst living on the plains. The plains were very open, and this meant that harsh winds could destroy the crops. The extreme heat in the summer could cause fires, and crops struggled to grow as there was so little water. The land had never been farmed before, and ploughing it was very hard work. Buffalo and other wild cattle could trample across farmland and ruin a year's crops. So let's have a look at the ways homesteaders survived and thrived on the plains and how they overcame some of these challenges that they were facing. Now, cleanliness was a major issue for the homesteaders. Because most of their houses had an earth floor, sod walls and a grass roof, mice, fleas and bedbugs were a constant problem. The lack of water in summer meant that it was difficult to keep clean, and in the winter, homesteaders could face hardship and hunger. Diseases such as cholera, typhoid, and many others were common, and lots of families had to deal with the devastating loss of a child. The climate of the plains was very extreme. In winter, homesteaders faced freezing temperatures and deep snow. In the summer, temperatures could rise in excess of 30 degrees and droughts were common. The lack of water was a serious problem for many. Not only did they need it for drinking, but they also needed it for their crops so that they wouldn't shrivel and die. For most homesteaders, the best solution was to drill a deep hole into the ground and then build a wind pump to bring the water to the surface. Another solution was something called dry farming. This was where farmers ploughed their land whenever there was heavy rain, and that left a thin layer of fine soil on top of the land, which trapped the water. Many farmers also started to experiment with new crops that could grow in more dry conditions or more extreme weathers. Families on the plains usually lived many miles away from their nearest neighbour, and it was often a long journey to the nearest town. People were forced to live isolated lives away from the wider families. They needed to be tough and independent. As time went on and more homesteaders moved onto the plains, churches and schools were built and little communities started to spring up, but contact with other families was always limited. All homesteaders faced the immediate challenge of ploughing their land so that they could plant seed. There was a shortage of labour on the plains, so the homesteaders had to do all the ploughing themselves. The plains had never been ploughed before, and the grass which grew there had tough roots and was difficult to remove. The iron ploughs which the homesteaders brought with them often broke under this strain and had to be repaired constantly. Most homesteaders lived far from the woods on the edge of the plains, and the lack of trees meant that building a house was one of the first challenges they faced. Most ended up building sod houses. These were made from dry blocks of earth. Grass would be used for the roof, and the walls were covered in mud to make them watertight. Now, unlike the cattlemen who we talked about in the first video, homesteaders needed to fence their land to show exactly which land belonged to them. They also needed to stop cattle from straying onto land which they had planted with crops. The lack of timber on the plains meant that it was difficult to build fences, but this was made easier with the invention of barbed wire in 1874. In addition to those physical challenges, homesteaders had to face a lot of natural hazards too. In the summer months, when the grasslands were bone dry, there was a great danger of fire. When a fire took hold across the plains, homesteads were destroyed and families could be forced to give up their homes. Another hazard on the plains was locusts. Between 1874 and 1877, locusts swarmed across parts of the Great Plains. They not only ate crops, but also leather boots, clothes, and even wooden window frames. A swarm of locusts could devastate a homestead and leave families with no crops at all. With no wood to burn, keeping warm in the harsh winter was a challenge for the homesteaders. Their only option was to burn dried buffalo and cow droppings. So that brings us to the end of our second video, and as you can see on your screen, we've now ticked off our first 2 bullet points for Unit 4. In the next video, we'll be focusing on the Indian Wars.